Shana Tova. Sam had just moved into his new apartment and was out celebrating with his friend Jeremy. After midnight, he invited Jeremy back to his new place where they continued to celebrate. Sam proudly showed his friend the apartment and all the high tech that it contained. Exploring Sam's home office, Jeremy couldn't help but notice a very large shofar sitting on his desk. "Why do you have a shofar in your office?" asked Jeremy. "Are you the Baal Tekiah? Are you the shofar blower at your shul?" "No," said Sam. "That's my clock." Sam picked up the shofar and blew it at the top of his lungs. First, a beautiful and strong Tekiah, and then a mournful shvarim, a perfectly broken and staccato teruah, followed by the wholeness of a Tekiah Gedolah that lasted a full 30 seconds. Impressed by Sam's skill, Jeremy nonetheless asked again, "How does the shofar function as a clock?" And suddenly, through the wall, someone in the apartment next door bellowed, "Stop that, you considerate oaf, it's 2:30 in the morning." Humorous indeed, unless you happen to be the person in the apartment next door. Numerous reports and common experience point to an increase in the frequency of thoughtless behaviors, as well as a recharacterization of the line of what is appropriate. What was once considered terribly shocking is now, in many instances, normalized. And so this Rosh Hashanah, I invite you on a journey with me as we look at the lost art of empathy. First a definition, and then an oiveh. Empathy can be defined as both a cognitive and an emotional understanding of another's world, reflecting both an ability to walk in someone else's shoes and to share their emotions and their feelings. Classic examples of a lack of empathy can be experienced at any major airport today. And if hanging out at Bush or Hobby is not your idea of a good time, clear evidence can be easily witnessed on YouTube. Just search for the A&E series appropriately named Fasten Your Seatbelt. In one 2021 episode, a woman on a flight was furious upon discovering that she had been seated next to an infant. So without permission, she simply moved the row back and took a new seat. When instructed that she could not do that, she made an uncomfortable scene, ranting and raving about how it was unfair, how she didn't do anything wrong. Ultimately, to the delight of many of her fellow passengers, she was escorted off the plane. But on the way out, after treating all within earshot to a barrage of colorful words, she actually leaned over and spat on the baby. What a wonderful world. Such an extreme example aside, we all sense that there's a distancing from derech eretz, from treating our fellow humans with respect and dignity. In our daily routines, we encounter more people than ever, but ironically, genuinely know fewer of them. Our treks distancing ourselves from derech eretz are further enhanced by the internet and smartphones, novel tools which simultaneously provide us with the necessary information we need while intensifying the experience of isolation. Technology has undoubtedly increased our access, but often at the cost of our humanity. We've learned that words comprise a mere 30 or 40% of our total communication. Body language, facial expressions, tone, verbal speed, they provide the vast majority of not only what needs to be heard, but which underlies true human connection. Yet so much of our contemporary communication is via text or email. Formats in which we need to rely merely on the words of others appearing on our screen, words which often get misconstrued. I recently joined my local online app Nextdoor. I spent a month observing all of the posts. Depressingly, the vast majority of those posts were complaints and attacks on others for perceived injustices. One morning, I woke up to a message from an individual who described being ticketed for having parked his car at the end of his driveway, the car extending across the sidewalk. I understand his frustration. However, rather than try to find resolution, he chose instead to inform the world that despite the extensive construction going on, he would now be parking on the congested street, assuring full blockage so that no one could pass. Later that day, my limit reached. Without citing the specific incident, I asked whether or not it was indeed common for so much negativity to be found on the site. One kind woman suggested that I needed to sift through the posts, for there were wonderful aspects to be found, including helping owners find their lost pets. I thanked her for her wisdom. 2 hours later, someone who clearly had only skimmed through all of the posts, absent the normal cues of communication, arrived at the conclusion and posted that I must be someone who hates animals and doesn't want them found. I wish I was kidding. In reality, no one Nextdoor or TikTok offering makes a difference in the collective level of empathy. But in the aggregate, each click helps energize the tsunami that we all sense. Alternatively, when face-to-face, a friend cries or shares with you a hilarious story, their voice, their expressions leap through the air, changing the listener in the process. We are better able to decode their thoughts and feelings. We are better able to read the cues, and we're naturally charged with their emotions. We worry about them. We laugh with them. In other words, we empathize. In his recent book, Handle with Care, describing his professional journey as a cardiologist and the state of modern medicine, our own Dr. Milton Klein portrays a common experience shared by many of us. As we sit in the office with the doctor who's asking us questions, the physician is seemingly preoccupied with recording our responses on his screen, only occasionally looking up. Milton emphatically rejects this type of medicine, insisting instead on having an assistant present to type the patient's responses so that he could sincerely engage with the person in crisis. Milton highlights the importance of looking at the patient and observing other contextual cues through the story of an older male patient telling him that all is proceeding well. There have been no complications. Meanwhile, behind him is his wife waving her arms frantically and expressing her total disagreement. If we want to effectively understand and relate to others, to share their experience, we need to look up. We need to look at the faces of the other. We must hear beyond their words. As expressed by David Thoreau, could there be a greater miracle than for us to look into each other's eyes for an instant? Technology is but one obstacle. Our hustle and bustle, our need to scramble from one activity to the next, has also hampered our ability to connect with others. In a famous experiment, psychologists John Darley and Dan Batson once asked Princeton seminary students to prepare a sermon on the biblical parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable tells of a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho who is robbed, beaten, and left for dead by criminals. Fortunately, a resident of Samaria later stumbles upon him. And as described in the New Testament book of Luke, the Samaritan had empathy, went to him, and bound his wounds. The Princeton Seminary students clearly understood the story's point, and each began to write about the power of such kind of caring. Darley and Batson then instructed the seminarians to walk over to an adjacent building to deliver their speech, but they added a twist. Some of the students were informed that their sermon would not begin for a while. They could take their time getting there. Others were instructed the time was tight. Students ambled or sprinted across Princeton's manicured grounds, but as they reached the adjacent building, they encountered a man slumped in a doorway. As the seminarians neared him, the man coughed and groaned in pain. In reality, he was an actor. He was an actor secretly recording the actions of each of the seminarians. Over 60% of these students, in no hurry, stopped and helped the slump man. But those in a rush, the number was 10%. The irony here is palpable. Students would not help a man lying on a sidewalk, groaning in pain, because they were in a hurry to give a speech about how important it is to help a man lying in pain on the sidewalk. How busy have we become? Are we too hurried to see, to care, to act, to help? In the haste of our daily routines, what messages are we internalizing which seemingly crush our empathy for others? What messages are we providing our children when in the rush to get from one activity to the next, we don't make the effort to notice or simply ignore the pain of others around us? Our Jewish texts and our sages have underscored the necessity of attending to the words of others, of caring for them, of providing for their needs, and assuring that our lives are intertwined. In Exodus, we are instructed, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." A later Torah verse commands us to not stand idly by the blood of our neighbors. Rabbinic texts demand of us, al tifros min hatzibor, don't separate yourself from the community. The need to feel for the other, the need to act on his or her behalf lies at the heart of what it truly means to be a serious Jew. Foundationally, empathy and compassion are a direct outcome of a mindset, a worldview of love. In his recent book, Judaism is About Love, Rabbi Shai Held highlights the very centrality of that feeling within Jewish tradition. He notes that the Bible commands us to love God, to love our neighbor, and to love the stranger, those outside of our comfortable social groups. There can be no higher achievement, and Held asserts that the fulfillment of these obligations is considered nothing less than walking in God's ways. It's almost a mistake to ask the question whether Judaism requires emotion or action, because it demands both. It demands both and believes that they can be mutually reinforcing. Held describes love as an existential position or life orientation leading us to feel certain things and to act in certain ways. the Bible itself also rejects that dichotomy. In the Tanakh, emotions are indistinguishable from the actions, the rituals, and the physical experiences to which they lead. We must feel the pain of the widow, of the orphan, of the poor, of all others who struggle, and we must act to alleviate their suffering. Jewish ethics demand and insist upon deeds of love from a heart of love. The embrace of empathy is hard. It's demanding. It requires us to understand and feel for those who have annoyed us, those who have angered us, and in the extreme have even harmed us or our loved ones. It's instinctually easy to turn inward, to tend to our own needs individually and collectively, and to ignore the suffering of the other. But in so doing, mechayenu, mechasdenu, what will we become? At this time of year, the path to greater empathy is part of the arduous striving for deep and meaningful tshuva. Recently in a chavurah, we had a discussion about this whole idea of tshuva, and what emerged was that it's really easy to have repentance for eating a piece of shrimp. Don't do it again. But by contrast, in his Mishnah Torah, Maimonides taught that the turning of our heart, the reshaping of our actions that are elicited by deep emotions, reflect a far more strenuous struggle. Moving from anger to empathy is a formidable pilgrimage through our own personal wildernesses. But it is this very turning of ourselves, a curbing of our destructive emotions, that's the reason we sit here this Rosh Hashanah. We need to depart this sanctuary differently, as better human beings, as better Jews than we entered. Well, I'm not a Trekkie in the traditional sense. I remain fascinated by the series, the Star Trek series, The Next Generation. There we encounter Deanna Troi, half human, half telepathic betazoid, renowned throughout the universe for her hyper-empathy. She can be at times incapacitated by her inability to shield herself from the pain of others. In contrast, Gene Roddenberry gives us the android Data, who is blind to the feelings of others. Data, driven by a computer-level cognition and precision, spends much of the series in search of the human experience of empathy. Ours is to find the equilibrium, the balance between these polar opposites of these mythical characters. Living in a society in which facts and education seem to be increasingly disregarded and or denigrated, we need more scholarship. We need more learning. But I also suggest that we find a way to superimpose upon our wisdom an additional challenge. Why not use our wisdom to be daring, to travel into the life of another? Let's see how it impacts who we are and who we wish to be. Rather than asking, where can I go next, perhaps we should be asking, in whose shoes should I stand next? These high holidays, we pray that the blast of the shofar will engulf us, will shake us to our cores. May it be God's will that the sounds of the shofar accompany us out of the synagogue and into the larger world, daily stimulating our vast capacities for love and empathy. As we plead with God, Shema Kolenu, hear our voices, may we look up and face one another. May we open our hearts to the souls of others. May we slow down and open our minds to notice the cues, so that we can infuse our world with a new and deeper empathy. as we turn the calendar page, may we embrace our role as vessels of goodness and godliness. It's 11:25 a.m.